The check ripped cleanly down the middle, the sound echoing in the executive suite like a slap across the face. President Howard Castellano held the two halves in his fists, his knuckles white with rage, his face crimson as he leaned across his mahogany desk. "We don't owe you a penny," he snapped, his voice sharp enough to cut glass. "Not one red cent for work that was already covered under your employment contract. You signed that agreement when you started here, and everything you create belongs to North Point Solutions. Everything." The torn check fluttered to the desk between us, the amount still visible on both halves. $68,000. Payment for 3 months of overtime, weekends sacrificed, holidays spent coding while everyone else celebrated with their families. Payment for the revolutionary architecture that would transform their entire platform, the designs that would put North Point ahead of every competitor in the market. But standing there in that moment, watching the pieces of that check settle onto the polished wood, something shifted inside me. The anger that should have consumed me never came. Instead, a calm clarity washed over everything, and I smiled. That smile seemed to unsettle him more than any argument could have. Howard's eyes narrowed, confusion flickering across his features for just a second before the arrogance returned. I reached into my portfolio, pulled out the resignation papers I'd prepared that morning, and placed them on his desk. My signature was already there, neat and final at the bottom of the page. Without a word, I turned toward the door, my heels clicking against the marble floor with measured precision. "That's right, walk away," Howard called after me, his voice dripping with contempt. "Good luck finding another position in this industry. I'll make sure every major player knows exactly why you left." I didn't look back, didn't dignify the threat with a response. The door closed behind me with a soft click, sealing off that chapter of my life. What Howard Castellano didn't know, what he couldn't have known because he never actually read the fine print of the consulting addendum I'd insisted on 6 months earlier, was that Clause 17 gave me full ownership of any proprietary architecture developed on my own time, using my own resources, that was not explicitly commissioned by the company in writing. Every weekend I'd spent at home, every holiday, every late night in my apartment, those designs had been mine. The code I'd written on company time had been basic framework, standard implementation, nothing revolutionary. But the architecture, the real innovation that would make it all work, that belonged to me. Stories like these remind us that sometimes the greatest victories come not from fighting back with anger, but from planning ahead with precision. Welcome to Payback Office Channel, where we explore the moments when patience and preparation turn the tables on those who underestimate us. If these stories resonate with you, if you believe in the power of strategic thinking over emotional reactions, consider subscribing to follow more journeys like this one. We're building a community on the path to 8,000 subscribers who appreciate that revenge is a dish best served with paperwork and proper planning. My name is Erica Hartwell, and for 7 years I served as the lead systems architect at North Point Solutions. My background isn't extraordinary, just a middle-class upbringing in Ohio that taught me the value of listening before speaking, of understanding that everyone carries their own struggles. That foundation shaped how I saw the world, how I built relationships, and ultimately, how I recognized when those relationships had become toxic beyond repair. The morning after that confrontation with Howard, I sat in a cafe 3 blocks from North Point's headquarters, watching the early commuters rush past the windows. My phone rested on the table in front of me, silent for now, but I knew that would change soon. Across from me sat Thomas Brennan, Chief Technology Officer of Apex Innovations, North Point's primary competitor for the past 5 years. We'd met at industry conferences, served on panels together, maintained a professional respect that never quite crossed into friendship, but never dipped into rivalry either. "I need to be absolutely clear about what you're offering," Thomas said, his coffee untouched as he reviewed the documents I'd brought. "This architecture, it's legitimately yours. There won't be legal complications." I slid the consulting addendum across the table, Clause 17 highlighted in yellow. I had an attorney review every word before I signed it. Howard was so eager to lock me into the employment contract that he barely glanced at the consulting terms. He assumed I was just being difficult, asking for minor concessions to feel like I had some control. Thomas read through the clause twice, his expression shifting from cautious to intrigued. And you developed all of this independently. Every core component. The framework I built at North Point was essentially a shell, functional but unremarkable. The real innovation, the architecture that makes it scalable and adaptive, that was created entirely on my own time, with my own equipment in my own home. Why come to us? You could license this to multiple companies, make significantly more than what we're offering. The question deserved honesty. Because North Point is planning to launch their new platform in 3 months. They've already started the marketing campaign, made promises to clients about capabilities that don't exist yet. If Apex can implement this architecture and go live first, you won't just beat them to market. You'll make their entire campaign look like vaporware. Thomas leaned back in his chair, a slow smile spreading across his face. That's not just about money for you. No, I admitted, it's not. Howard Castellano destroyed someone I know. A colleague who questioned one of his decisions got blacklisted so thoroughly that she had to leave the industry entirely. He's built an empire on taking credit for other people's innovations and crushing anyone who challenges him. This isn't personal revenge, it's accountability. We shook hands across the table, the contract signed, the terms agreed upon. Apex Innovations would have exclusive rights to my architecture for 18 months, with a licensing fee that was triple what North Point had refused to pay me, plus a percentage of revenue from any products using the technology. The implementation timeline was aggressive, 8 weeks to full deployment, but Thomas assured me that his development team was among the best in the industry. I would serve as a consulting architect, guiding the integration but not directly employed, maintaining the independence that had become precious to me. The first week at Apex felt like stepping into an alternate universe. The development team actually listened during meetings instead of interrupting to explain my own designs back to me. The project managers asked questions about feasibility before making promises to clients. The budget included time for testing and refinement rather than expecting miracles through mandatory overtime. I worked with a senior developer named Allison Fletcher, who had the rare combination of technical brilliance and genuine humility. She understood the architecture almost immediately, asking insightful questions that helped me refine components I'd thought were already optimized. This adaptive scaling protocol, Allison said during our third planning session, her stylus hovering over the digital whiteboard. The way it predicts resource needs based on usage patterns, I've never seen anything quite like it. How did you develop the prediction algorithm? We spent 2 hours diving into the mathematics, the behavioral modeling, the thousands of simulations I'd run in my apartment, while North Point assumed I was simply working late on their standard projects. Allison's contributions during that conversation actually improved the algorithm, something that had never happened at North Point, where my suggestions were either dismissed or claimed by someone higher up the hierarchy. By week 3, the core systems were operational. By week 5, they were running test scenarios that exceeded every performance benchmark. By week 7, Apex's leadership was looking at a fully functional platform that could do everything North Point had promised their clients, plus capabilities that hadn't even been part of the original vision. Thomas called me into his office on a Friday afternoon, his expression carefully neutral in a way that made my pulse quicken with uncertainty. "We're ready to go live," he said, gesturing to the chair across from his desk. "The board reviewed the final tests yesterday and approved immediate deployment. We're scheduling the official launch announcement for Monday morning." "That's ahead of schedule," I noted, calculating the timeline in my head. "By 2 weeks. Your architecture is that good, and our team," he paused, choosing words carefully, "they're motivated. Several of them worked at North Point before. They know exactly what Howard Castellano is like, and they're invested in this success." Something in his tone suggested there was more to the conversation. I waited, letting the silence stretch. "We've also received information through industry channels that North Point is experiencing significant problems with their platform development. Apparently, the framework their team built isn't scaling properly. They're running into critical failures during stress testing. That would make sense, I said. The framework was never designed to handle the load they're promising. It needs the adaptive architecture to function at that scale. Howard's been telling clients the launch is still on schedule for next month. He's convinced his team can solve the technical problems in time. They can't, not without completely rebuilding from the foundation, which would take at least 6 months with their current resources. Thomas nodded slowly. So when we launch Monday, and North Point is still weeks away from even basic functionality. The industry will notice, clients will notice, investors will definitely notice. The weekend before the launch, I stayed home, ignoring the constant buzz of my phone as former colleagues from North Point reached out with increasingly worried messages. Apparently, word had spread that I was working with Apex, and people were starting to connect the dots between my departure and North Point's sudden technical catastrophe. One message stood out from the others, sent late Saturday night from a developer named Grace, who'd been one of the few friendly faces during my time at North Point. Erica, I don't know what you're planning, but Howard is panicking. He brought in external consultants who confirmed that the platform won't work without major architectural changes. He's talking about delaying the launch, but the board won't let him. They've invested too much in the marketing campaign. Please tell me you're not doing what I think you're doing. I typed and deleted 3 different responses before finally settling on something simple and honest. I'm doing exactly what my contract allowed me to do. What happens to North Point now is a consequence of Howard's choices, not mine. Monday morning arrived with crystalline autumn sunshine, the kind of day that felt pregnant with possibility. I dressed carefully, professional but not formal, confident but not aggressive, and arrived at Apex's headquarters an hour before the scheduled press conference. The media turnout exceeded expectations. Technology journalists, industry analysts, financial reporters, even a few bloggers who specialized in corporate drama. Thomas had positioned the announcement as a major innovation reveal, and the industry had responded with intense curiosity. The presentation was flawless. Thomas introduced the platform's capabilities with clear, verifiable demonstrations. Allison walked through technical specifications that proved the claims weren't just marketing hype. The chief operating officer announced 3 major clients who'd already signed implementation contracts over the weekend, including 2 companies that had been in negotiations with North Point. And then Thomas introduced me. The architecture that makes all of this possible was developed by Erica Hartwell, who joins Apex as our senior innovation consultant. Her vision and technical expertise have positioned us to deliver solutions the industry has been waiting for. The recognition was professional, appropriate, and completely foreign to me after years of watching Howard claim credit for work his team had done. I spoke briefly about the development philosophy behind the architecture, answered a few technical questions from journalists who actually understood the subject matter, and then stepped back to let Thomas handle the business implications. That's when my phone started ringing. The first call came from a number I didn't recognize. I silenced it, focusing on the press conference conclusion. The second call was from North Point's main line. The third was from Howard's direct office number. The fourth was from a number I recognized as belonging to North Point's legal department. By the time the press conference ended and the journalists dispersed to file their stories, I had 17 missed calls and 9 voicemails. I didn't need to listen to them to know what they contained. Thomas found me in the break room an hour later, reviewing the initial media coverage on my tablet. The headlines were uniformly positive for Apex, and by extension, devastating for North Point. Tech innovation leader Apex delivers next-generation platform ahead of schedule. Former North Point architect brings revolutionary design to competitor. Sources say North Point platform facing critical development problems. They're threatening to sue, Thomas said without preamble, setting his own phone on the table. Howard Castellano personally called our legal team claiming theft of intellectual property, breach of contract, corporate espionage. Their attorneys are drafting paperwork as we speak. They don't have a case, I replied. the calm certainty in my voice surprising even me. Every component of the architecture was developed independently, documented with timestamps and version control that proves creation dates. The consulting addendum explicitly gives me ownership of work created under those specific conditions. Our lawyers agree with you, but that doesn't mean North Point won't try. Howard's apparently threatening to drag this out in court for years, make it too expensive for us to defend. He's bluffing. A protracted legal battle would require him to disclose why his platform is failing, which would mean admitting to investors and clients that he can't deliver on his promises. The lawsuit threat is designed to scare us into a settlement. Thomas studied me for a long moment. You've thought through every angle of this. I had 3 months to plan while working overtime on a framework I knew would never function without the architecture Howard refused to pay me for. Yes, I've thought through every angle. My phone rang again, the vibration rattling against the table surface. This time it was from my former manager at North Point, a woman named Diane who'd always treated me with distant professionalism, but never outright hostility. I answered, putting it on speaker with a questioning glance at Thomas. He nodded, staying quiet. Erica, thank goodness. Diane's voice was strained, barely controlled panic underneath the professional tone. I need you to understand the situation here. The platform is completely non-functional. We have demonstrations scheduled with major clients starting next week. The board is threatening to fire the entire development department if we can't deliver. That sounds difficult, I said, keeping my voice neutral. Please, can we discuss bringing you back? As a consultant, if not a full employee? Name your price, we'll meet it. We need the architecture. The architecture belongs to Apex Innovations now. Exclusive licensing for 18 months. But you created it while working here. You used company resources, company time. I have timestamped documentation proving every component was created on my personal equipment, on my own time, under the terms of a consulting addendum that your legal department approved. The framework I created on company time is still yours. The problem is that framework doesn't actually do what Howard promised clients it would do. Silence stretched across the connection. When Diane spoke again, her voice had changed, anger replacing desperation. You planned this. You deliberately created something you knew wouldn't work without the rest of the system. I created exactly what was requested in writing by my direct supervisors. If Howard made promises beyond those specifications without confirming technical feasibility, that's a management failure, not a development failure. He'll destroy you for this, you know he will. He's welcome to try. I ended the call and looked at Thomas, who was staring at me with an expression somewhere between admiration and concern. That was cold, he said. That was accurate. Everything I said was factually correct and legally defensible. I'm not criticizing. I'm just recalibrating my understanding of who you are. The media coverage intensified throughout the day. Technology blogs published detailed analyses comparing Apex's demonstrated capabilities with North Point's promised features, noting the suspicious similarities and asking pointed questions about the development timeline. Financial analysts started downgrading North Point's stock rating, citing unspecified technical challenges and leadership concerns. By Tuesday morning, North Point stock had dropped 12%. By Wednesday, it was down 23% and still falling. Major clients who'd been in final negotiations for the new platform announced they were exploring other options in carefully worded press releases. Howard Castellano appeared on a technology podcast Wednesday afternoon, his voice tight with controlled rage as he dismissed concerns about the platform development. We're experiencing minor delays due to our commitment to quality and security. Unlike some competitors who rush untested technology to market, North Point maintains the highest standards for our products. We will launch when we're confident in delivering excellence, not when some arbitrary marketing schedule demands it. The host, a journalist named Ryan who'd been covering technology development for 15 years, didn't let the deflection slide. But sources within North Point have suggested the delays aren't minor, that there are fundamental architectural problems that could take months to resolve. And there are questions about the similarities between what Apex demonstrated and what North Point has been promising. Can you address the speculation that your former lead systems architect took proprietary technology to a competitor? We are exploring all legal options regarding potential intellectual property theft. I can't comment on specific details while our attorneys review the situation, but I can say with confidence that North Point will vigorously defend its interests and hold accountable anyone who violated their contractual obligations. I listened to the podcast while working on integration refinements with Allison, and when Howard's voice faded into closing remarks, she looked over at me with raised eyebrows. He really believes he's the victim in this story. He believes his position gives him ownership of everything around him, including other people's work. The concept that I could create something valuable independent of his authority doesn't fit his worldview. What happens when he realizes the lawsuit won't work? Then he'll try to bargain, offer a partnership, suggest we license the technology to North Point, appeal to industry unity or professional courtesy. When that doesn't work, he'll try to poach Apex employees, especially anyone who worked on the integration. And when all of that fails, he'll try to rebuild his platform from scratch, which will take long enough that North Point loses its market position entirely. You've really mapped out every possibility. Not every possibility, just the predictable ones. The lawsuit arrived Thursday morning, delivered to Apex's legal department with appropriate dramatic flair. 47 pages of accusations, demands, and thinly veiled threats, all building toward a claim that I had stolen proprietary technology worth an estimated $80 million and delivered it to a direct competitor. Our legal team spent 6 hours reviewing every detail before calling a meeting with Thomas, myself, and Apex's chief legal officer, a sharp-eyed woman named Francine who'd spent 20 years in intellectual property law before joining the company. "This is theater," Francine announced, dropping the lawsuit documents onto the conference room table. "Expensive theater, but theater nonetheless. They don't have a case, and their attorneys know it. Every claim rests on the assumption that work performed by an employee automatically belongs to the employer, which is generally true except when explicit contractual language says otherwise." She pulled out the consulting addendum, the same document I'd shown Thomas weeks earlier, and placed it beside the lawsuit. Clause 17 is airtight. It specifies ownership terms for work created independently, provides clear criteria for what qualifies as independent work, and was signed by both parties with legal representation present. North Point's own legal department reviewed and approved this language. "So why file the lawsuit at all?" Thomas asked. "Pressure. They're hoping we'll settle just to avoid the cost and distraction of litigation. They're also trying to create a narrative that positions them as the victim of theft rather than a company that failed to deliver on its promises. If they can make this about stolen technology rather than mismanagement, they might salvage some credibility with investors and clients." "What's our response strategy?" Francine smiled, and there was nothing warm in the expression. "We file a countersuit for defamation and tortious interference. Their public claims about theft and contract violations are demonstrably false and have damaged both your reputation and Apex's business relationships. We also file a motion to compel discovery, which means they'll have to provide documentation of their development timeline, internal communications about the project, and Howard Castellano's decisions regarding your compensation." "Discovery will expose everything they're trying to hide," I said, understanding dawning. "The fact that they have nothing functional, that Howard refused payment for work he never commissioned in writing, all the internal chaos." "Exactly. They'll withdraw the lawsuit rather than face that exposure. But we need your documentation to be absolutely comprehensive. Every timestamp, every version control record, every piece of evidence that proves independent creation." I'd been preparing that documentation for 3 months, organizing it every evening after those long days at North Point when I knew the confrontation was inevitable. By Friday afternoon, I'd delivered everything to Francine: development logs showing creation dates and modification histories, receipts for equipment purchases proving I'd used my own resources, Even electricity bills showing increased home usage during the hours I'd worked on the architecture. The countersuit was filed Monday morning, and the industry reaction was immediate. Technology journalists who'd initially covered the story as a standard corporate dispute suddenly recognized it as something more significant. This wasn't just about one company versus another. It was about employee rights, intellectual property ownership, and the power dynamics that governed the entire industry. A prominent tech blogger named Samantha Ortiz published a detailed analysis that went viral within hours, drawing connections to broader patterns of companies claiming ownership of employee innovations regardless of contractual terms. The North Point situation raises critical questions about how we value innovation and who truly owns creative work. If Erica Hartwell's documentation proves she developed this architecture independently, using her own time and resources, then North Point's lawsuit isn't just legally questionable. It's an attempt to claim ownership of human thought itself. The article sparked debates across social media, technology forums, and professional networks. Developers shared their own stories of companies claiming ownership of weekend projects, late-night coding experiments, and innovations created entirely outside of work responsibilities. The conversation expanded beyond the specific case to address systemic issues that had been quietly accepted for years. Howard Castellano attempted to control the narrative with a formal press release Tuesday afternoon. But the language was so carefully sanitized by legal review that it said essentially nothing, while somehow making North Point look worse. North Point Solutions remains committed to protecting its intellectual property and maintaining the trust of our clients and partners. We are confident that the legal process will demonstrate the validity of our concerns and look forward to a resolution that upholds the principles of fair business practices. The stock price dropped another 8%. By Wednesday, sources inside North Point were leaking information to journalists with increasing frequency. Someone provided internal emails showing Howard had been warned months earlier that the platform framework wouldn't scale without additional architectural development. Another leak revealed that the board had questioned the aggressive launch timeline, only to be assured by Howard that his team could deliver. The most damaging leak came Thursday morning. A recording of a development team meeting where Howard had explicitly stated that he wouldn't authorize payment for architectural work because everything they create belongs to us anyway, and I'm not paying twice for the same product. That recording made it clear that Howard had understood the distinction between the framework and the architecture, but had chosen to claim ownership through assertion rather than negotiation. The narrative shifted decisively. This wasn't a case of employee theft. It was a case of executive overreach and employee exploitation. Thomas found me in the testing lab Thursday afternoon, where I'd been working with Allison on performance optimization protocols. Howard's attorneys contacted Francine this morning, he said, his expression carefully controlled. They want to discuss settlement terms. Already, the leaked recording destroyed their position. They can't claim good faith misunderstanding when there's audio of Howard explicitly stating he wouldn't pay for work he knew was separately commissioned. They want to settle before discovery forces them to reveal even more damaging information. What are they offering? Complete dismissal of their lawsuit with prejudice, meaning they can never file similar claims again. Public statement acknowledging that you developed the architecture independently and acted within your contractual rights, and a payment to you personally for defamation damages. How much? $200,000. The number hung in the air between us, more than triple what Howard had refused to pay me originally, but the context had changed entirely. This wasn't payment for work. This was acknowledgement of wrongdoing. Francine thinks we should counter at $400,000, Thomas continued. They're desperate to end this quickly, and the longer it drags out, the more damage it does to their stock price and client relationships. What do you think? He considered for a moment before answering. I think you've already won everything that matters. The money is just a number. The real victory is that everyone in the industry now knows exactly what happened, and Howard Castellano's reputation will never recover. The settlement negotiations took 11 days, each one marked by incremental shifts in leverage and positioning. Northpoint's legal team started at $200,000 and firm refusal to admit any specific wrongdoing. Our team countered at $500,000, with explicit acknowledgement of defamatory statements and business interference. The compromise landed at $375,000, a public statement that walked the careful line between legal admission and factual acknowledgement, and a confidentiality agreement that prevented either party from discussing settlement terms, but explicitly allowed both parties to discuss the underlying facts of the case. That last provision was critical. I wanted the freedom to explain what had happened without legal constraints, to ensure other developers understood their rights and options when facing similar situations. The statement went public on a Friday afternoon, timed to minimize immediate media attention, but still providing information to anyone specifically following the story. Northpoint Solutions and Erica Hartwell have reached an amicable resolution regarding all claims and counterclaims related to the development of certain technological architecture. Northpoint acknowledges that Ms. Hartwell acted within her contractual rights and wishes her success in her future endeavors. Both parties consider this matter fully resolved. The blandness of the language couldn't hide what everyone in the industry understood. Northpoint had backed down completely. Howard Castellano's attempt to claim ownership of my work had failed, publicly and expensively. The financial settlement transferred into my account the following Monday, and I spent that evening sitting in my apartment, looking at the number on my banking app and trying to process the cascade of events that had led to this moment. The money mattered, certainly. It represented acknowledgement and accountability, tangible proof that actions had consequences, but the real shift was subtler and more profound. 3 different companies had contacted me in the past week, offering consulting contracts, speaking engagements, advisory positions. Technology conferences wanted me to present on intellectual property rights and independent development practices. A publisher had reached out about a potential book on innovation ownership in corporate environments. The story had resonated beyond the immediate circumstances, touching something raw in an industry that often treated creative work as a commodity to be extracted rather than valued. Developers were questioning their contracts, demanding clearer language around ownership, pushing back against blanket claims that everything they created belonged to their employers. Howard Castellano announced his resignation from Northpoint 2 weeks after the settlement, the press release citing personal reasons and new opportunities in language that fooled no one. Sources inside the company confirmed that the board had forced him out, unwilling to tolerate the ongoing damage to Northpoint's reputation and market position. His replacement was an external hire, a former technology executive named Andrea Wolf, who'd built a reputation for ethical leadership and employee development. Her first major decision was restructuring Northpoint's intellectual property policies to clearly distinguish between work performed as part of employment responsibilities and independent innovation created outside those boundaries. The platform that Howard had promised, the one that had sparked this entire confrontation, was quietly canceled. Northpoint announced a strategic refocusing that abandoned the technology sector their failed platform was supposed to dominate. The company survived, but diminished, a cautionary tale about the costs of executive arrogance and employee exploitation. Apex Innovations, meanwhile, thrived. The platform I'd helped develop became an industry standard within 6 months, adopted by major corporations that valued its reliability and scalability. Allison was promoted to lead systems architect, and we continued collaborating on refinements and expansions that pushed the technology into new applications. Thomas offered me a permanent position as Chief Innovation Officer, but I declined in favor of maintaining my consulting independence. The experience with Northpoint had taught me the value of controlling my own work, of maintaining the freedom to walk away from situations that compromised my principles. Instead, I built a consulting practice that focused on helping other developers understand their rights, structure contracts that protected their innovations, and navigate the complex intersection of employment law and intellectual property. The work was satisfying in ways that pure technical development had never been, combining my engineering background with a broader mission of systemic change. 6 months after the settlement, I received an email from Grace, my former colleague at North Point who'd sent that worried message before Apex's launch announcement. She'd left the company shortly after Howard's resignation, following several other senior developers who recognized the toxic culture wasn't going to change overnight despite new leadership. "I wanted to thank you," she wrote. "Watching how you handled everything, how you stood up for yourself without backing down or compromising your principles, it gave me the courage to do the same. I'm working independently now, on projects I actually believe in, with contracts that respect my contributions. You showed a lot of us that there was another way." Those words meant more than the settlement money, more than the professional opportunities, more than any measure of conventional success. The story had never been just about my specific situation. It had been about challenging a system that devalued creative work and the people who produced it. The industry began changing in small but meaningful ways. More companies adopted clear intellectual property policies that distinguished between employment work and independent creation. Professional organizations developed model contract language that protected both employer and employee interests. Developers became more willing to negotiate terms rather than accepting standard agreements that claimed unlimited ownership of their innovations. None of these changes happened quickly or completely. Corporate culture shifts gradually, resisting transformation until the cost of stagnation exceeds the discomfort of change. But the conversation had started, and it continued growing, spreading through professional networks and industry publications until it became impossible to ignore. I thought sometimes about Howard Castellano, wondered if he understood what had actually happened. Did he recognize that his refusal to pay $68,000 had ultimately cost him his position, his reputation, and his company's market dominance? Did he see the connection between his actions and the consequences, or did he still view himself as the victim of betrayal rather than the architect of his own downfall? The answer didn't really matter. His understanding or lack thereof wouldn't change the outcome. The story was never about him anyway. It was about the choice to stand firm when facing institutional pressure, to value your own work enough to fight for fair treatment, to recognize that sometimes the most powerful response to injustice is patient, methodical preparation. A year after leaving North Point, I was invited to speak at a technology conference in Seattle, addressing an audience of several hundred developers about intellectual property rights and contract negotiation. Standing on that stage, looking at faces that reflected my own earlier uncertainty and determination, I shared the story honestly and completely. I talked about the years of work at North Point, the gradual recognition that my contributions were being undervalued, the decision to protect my innovations through careful contract language. I described the confrontation with Howard, the torn check, the calm clarity that had guided every subsequent decision. But I also talked about the doubt, the moments of uncertainty when I questioned whether I was making the right choice. The fear that I might be burning bridges I'd need later, sacrificing career stability for abstract principles. The weight of standing alone against institutional power, and having to trust that preparation and documentation would be enough. The outcome worked in my favor, I told that audience, but that wasn't guaranteed. I could have lost the legal battle, been blacklisted from the industry, seen my career destroyed for standing up for myself. The decision to fight back wasn't easy or simple. It was terrifying. But the alternative was worse. The alternative was accepting that my work, my creativity, my innovation could be claimed by someone else simply because they held a position of authority. And I couldn't live with that, not because I'm especially brave or principled, but because I knew I'd never respect myself again if I backed down. The response to that speech surprised me. Dozens of developers approached afterward, sharing their own stories of contract disputes, ownership conflicts, situations where they'd felt powerless against corporate pressure. Many had backed down, accepted unfair terms, walked away from innovations they'd created because fighting back seemed impossible. but some had stood firm, negotiated better terms, challenged unfair policies. And all of them, whether they'd succeeded or compromised, shared a common recognition that the system needed to change, and individual actions, wins and losses alike, contributed to that broader transformation. The consulting practice grew steadily, fueled by referrals from satisfied clients and a reputation for practical, strategic advice. I worked with individual developers negotiating employment contracts, small companies structuring intellectual property policies, and industry organizations developing best practices for innovation ownership. Each case was unique in its details, but similar in underlying dynamics. People creating value and wanting fair recognition for their contributions. Organizations trying to protect legitimate business interests while sometimes overreaching into unethical territory. The tension between those positions, and the legal frameworks that tried to balance competing rights. One client, a software developer named Jackson, who'd created a revolutionary algorithm in his spare time, came to me after his employer demanded ownership despite clear evidence of independent creation. His contract included language similar to what I'd negotiated at North Point, but his employer was threatening termination and blacklisting if he didn't surrender the intellectual property. We spent 3 months documenting his independent development process, gathering evidence that would prove creation, timeline, and methodology. When his employer's legal team reviewed our documentation, they quietly withdrew their demands, recognizing they had no legitimate claim and facing potential liability for attempted coercion. Jackson's algorithm became the foundation for a startup he launched 6 months later, eventually acquired by a major technology company for an 8-figure sum. He credited our work together with making that success possible, and while I appreciated the recognition, the real satisfaction came from knowing he'd kept control of something he'd created. Another client, a designer named Olivia, faced a different challenge. Her employer had legitimate ownership of work she'd done during employment, but was claiming that ownership extended to design methodologies and conceptual frameworks she'd developed over years of professional practice. They'd sent a cease and desist letter demanding she stop using those approaches in her independent consulting work. The case required careful analysis of what could actually be owned versus general professional knowledge and skill development. We successfully argued that fundamental design principles and problem-solving methodologies couldn't be claimed as proprietary, that her employer owned specific deliverables, but not the expertise she'd cultivated through experience. The victory allowed Olivia to continue her consulting practice without artificial restrictions, and the case became a reference point for other designers facing similar overreach. The employer revised their intellectual property policies after realizing how badly their aggressive approach had damaged their professional reputation. These stories, and dozens like them, reinforced my understanding that the situation with North Point hadn't been an isolated incident. It was part of a broader pattern where organizations claimed excessive ownership rights, betting that individual employees wouldn't have the resources or determination to fight back. Each successful challenge to that pattern created precedent and possibility for others. Each developer who stood firm, each company that revised unfair policies, each case that clarified the boundaries of legitimate ownership, all of it contributed to gradual systematic improvement. 2 years after leaving North Point, I was contacted by Andrea Wolf, the executive who'd replaced Howard Castellano. She wanted to discuss bringing me in as a consultant to review and refine North Point's intellectual property policies, ensuring they protected both company interests and employee rights. The irony wasn't lost on either of us. She acknowledged it directly in our first meeting, held at a neutral location rather than North Point's headquarters. I understand if working with us in any capacity feels inappropriate given your history with the company, Andrea said. But I'm trying to build something different here, a culture that values innovation by respecting the people who create it. Your expertise and perspective would be valuable in that process. I considered the offer carefully, weighing the obvious complications against the potential impact. Working with North Point again would raise eyebrows throughout the industry, invite speculation about motivations and compromises, but it would also demonstrate that meaningful change was possible, that organizations could acknowledge past failures and commit to better practices. "I'll consult on the policy development," I finally answered, "but I want complete transparency about my involvement. No hiding the fact that you brought in the person your predecessor tried to sue. Make it clear that this is about acknowledging what went wrong and fixing it." Andrea agreed immediately, and the engagement was announced through a joint statement that didn't shy away from the complicated history. North Point Solutions has engaged Erica Hartwell as a consultant to review and enhance our intellectual property policies. We recognize that past practices fell short of our values, and we're committed to creating frameworks that fairly balance organizational and individual interests. Ms. Hartwell's expertise and experience make her uniquely qualified to guide this important work. The industry reaction was mixed. Some praised North Point for taking concrete action to address cultural problems. Others criticized the move as performative, suggesting that hiring me was more about public relations than genuine change. A few questioned my decision to work with a company that had treated me so poorly. I understood all those perspectives and acknowledged their validity. But the work itself proved worthwhile, revealing how poorly designed policies had enabled Howard's overreach while leaving employees without clear guidance or protection. We developed new language that explicitly defined what counted as work product belonging to the company versus independent innovation owned by the individual. We created processes for employees to register independent projects, establishing clear documentation of timeline and resources. We structured review procedures that allowed disputes to be resolved through mediation rather than legal intimidation. The revised policies became a model that other companies studied and adapted, demonstrating that protecting employee rights didn't undermine business interests. If anything, the clearer frameworks improved morale and innovation by allowing people to pursue creative work without fear that success would be confiscated. My contract with North Point concluded after 6 months, the new policies implemented, and staff training completed. Andrea sent a personal note thanking me for the work and acknowledging the courage it took to engage with an organization that had caused me significant harm. "You could have refused and no one would have questioned that choice," she wrote. "Instead, you chose to be part of the solution, to help ensure that what happened to you wouldn't happen to others here. That's leadership that goes beyond self-interest, and I'm grateful." The note mattered, not because I needed validation from North Point, but because it confirmed that the story had come full circle. What started as a conflict over payment and ownership had evolved into meaningful structural change that would benefit people I'd never meet, working on innovations I'd never see. 3 years after that confrontation with Howard, after the torn check and the calm decision to walk away, I found myself reflecting on what the experience had taught me about power, justice, and the long game of strategic patience. The immediate satisfaction of revenge had never been the goal. Walking out of Howard's office that day, I hadn't been thinking about destroying his career or damaging North Point. I'd been thinking about protecting work I'd created and ensuring I received fair compensation for that value. The broader consequences, Howard's resignation, North Point's market struggles, the industry-wide conversation about intellectual property rights, those had emerged from the fundamental injustice of the situation being exposed to scrutiny. The revenge, if it could even be called that, came from simply telling the truth and refusing to accept unfair treatment. That distinction mattered. Revenge driven by anger often creates collateral damage, hurting innocent people and ultimately corrupting the person seeking it. But accountability driven by principle, strategic planning, and clear documentation that created change without unnecessary destruction. Howard had lost his position and reputation not because I'd set out to ruin him, but because his own actions couldn't withstand examination. North Point had struggled not because I'd sabotaged them, but because Howard had made promises the company couldn't deliver on without technology they didn't own. The lesson extended beyond the specific situation. In any conflict where power is unevenly distributed, the temptation exists to either submit to unjust treatment or respond with equally unjust aggression. But there's a third path: methodical preparation, clear documentation, strategic positioning, and the patience to let consequences unfold naturally. That path requires more discipline than either submission or aggression. It demands planning instead of reaction, precision instead of emotion, confidence in long-term outcomes instead of immediate satisfaction. But the results tend to be more sustainable and less destructive, creating change without becoming what you're fighting against. The consulting practice continued growing. My speaking engagements expanded to address broader questions of workplace ethics and innovation culture. And the story of what happened at North Point became a case study taught in business schools and legal programs. But the most meaningful impact came through individual conversations with developers who reached out to share how the story had influenced their own decisions. People who'd negotiated better contracts, challenged unfair policies, or simply recognized their own value enough to demand appropriate treatment. Each of those conversations reminded me that the story was never really about me, or Howard, or even North Point specifically. It was about the broader principle that creative work has value, that people deserve fair compensation for their contributions, and that systems claiming unlimited ownership of human innovation need to be challenged and changed. Stories like this one, where careful planning and documented rights overcome institutional pressure, they matter because they demonstrate possibility. They show that standing up for yourself isn't futile, that power imbalances aren't permanent, that strategic thinking can level playing fields tilted by authority and resources. If you've found value in this journey, if something in this story resonates with your own experiences or aspirations, consider subscribing to follow more explorations of how strategic patience and proper preparation can transform challenging situations into opportunities for meaningful change. Every subscription helps us build a community that believes in accountability, values innovation, and understands that sometimes the best revenge is simply refusing to accept injustice. The phone on Howard's desk had rung that day, frantically, as news of Apex's launch spread through the industry, and the full scope of North Point's technical failures became impossible to hide. I imagine him sitting there, watching the carefully constructed narrative of his success crumbling, finally understanding that the woman he dismissed so casually had been 10 steps ahead the entire time. That image brings me no particular joy or satisfaction. Howard's downfall was a consequence of his choices, not a victory I celebrated. But it serves as a reminder that underestimating people, especially those you've wronged, is a dangerous form of arrogance. The work continues. New cases, new clients, new challenges in the ongoing project of making industry systems more fair and equitable. Each situation is unique, but the underlying principles remain constant. Document everything, understand your rights, plan strategically, and never accept that authority grants unlimited power. And sometimes, when someone tears up a check and tells you they don't owe you a penny, the best response is a calm smile, a signed resignation, and the clause they never bothered to read. The consequences will follow soon enough, as inevitable as the phone ringing frantically in an executive suite where panic is just beginning to set in. Because in the end, the greatest power isn't the ability to dominate or control. It's the ability to prepare, to protect your interests, to stand firm when tested, and to trust that documented truth will eventually overcome convenient lies. That's the lesson Howard Castellano learned too late, and the lesson I carry forward into every consultation, every negotiation, every conversation about fairness and innovation, and the value of creative work. The torn check is long gone, recycled or discarded or perhaps kept as evidence during legal proceedings. But the principle it represented remains. Some debts can't be dismissed through position or authority, and some people won't back down simply because fighting back seems difficult. The platform Apex launched that day, built on architecture I'd created independently and protected through careful contractual language. It's still running, still scaling, still demonstrating what's possible when innovation is valued and properly compensated. And somewhere in an office I'll never visit, A phone once rang frantically as reality caught up with promises that were never achievable, as consequences arrived for choices made in arrogance and authority. That phone call, that moment of recognition, it wasn't the goal. But it was justice, delivered not through anger or aggression, but through the simple power of preparation meeting opportunity, of documented rights confronting baseless claims, of strategic patience outlasting institutional pressure. Sometimes that's enough, sometimes that's everything,